Hi everyone, Pastor Alex here. Welcome back to our online Bible study as we continue our look at the epistle of 1 Peter. We are still in chapter 1 and we are picking up in verse 17. This is part of the opening of the letter body after Peter has celebrated the work of God in his opening prayer for the lives of the believers to whom he is writing. He picks up with that, concludes that means we are to live our lives focused completely on this hope. We've been saved for hope, which is the salvation of our souls and the final resurrection. That's what all of Scripture has been pointing to in the death and resurrection of Jesus, this new time of salvation, this new time that Christians have been gathered in this new covenant relationship by the Father who has showed himself through the saving work of Jesus and his resurrection from the dead. And so we are to conduct ourselves with that living hope, and that means girding up the loins of our minds, being ready for action, being ready to make decisions, and a clear-headed decisions, being sober in how we discern our life, now relating to the cultures around us, the world around us in a very different way, with faith and trust in our Lord and obedience to him as the main priority. That's what this new birth means. It means we're resident aliens, we're foreigners in the world around us now that we have this new relationship going on. And so Peter is picking up that idea in verse 17. So we will pick that up, and again, reading from the Greek here, Peter is writing, "And if you call upon the one who judges without respect to persons, who judges according to each person's work, if you call him Father, conduct yourselves with fear at the time or during the time of your sojourn, your resident alien, your alien residency, we might say. Because," verse 18, "because knowing that, I should say, knowing that, not with perishable things, with gold or silver that you have been redeemed out of the vain ways of life of your ancestral traditions, but with a price of blood, the blood of Christ, as a lamb who is spotless and unblemished, who was foreknown, being foreknown before the foundations of the world, and being manifest at the last times, on your account, who through him believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave to him glory, so that your faith and hope would be in God." All right. So verse 17 is picking up this idea that because we are given new birth through the gospel and in Jesus, we are now children of God, and so we are able to call upon God as Father. And indeed, that's what happens. As Christians, we are given a boldness and a confidence because we have a new relationship to God where we are part of his family. And so that gives us the ability to boldly refer to him as Father in our prayers and in our worship. It is a familial and intimate relationship that we have with God. Peter in chapter 3 is going to say that through baptism, we are saved and have a clear conscience towards God. We have a boldness in how we can approach God, and we call upon him rightfully as our Father, just as Jesus has a relationship of Father, has a Son to the Father. So Jesus extends that love by redeeming us by his own blood to be adopted into this family so that we have the same relationship. But Peter does not want us to presume upon that relationship. God, as the same God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, as he is revealed, is the one who judges impartially. the one who doesn't look at the outward externals of one's life, status or wealth, the sort of fronts and veneers that we put on, things that people would pay attention to. You can imagine in 1 Samuel, King Saul is anointed as king, and the people have great respect for him because he's so good looking and he's a head taller than everyone else. But he's one who's not truly obedient to God, unlike David, who follows God from his heart. He's a man after God's own heart. And so we see there that God reveals himself as one who judges according to the heart, according to the character of one's deeds, and the character that expresses itself in deeds. We also see that Yahweh is the one who has great concern for those of lowly status, of the widow and the orphan and the poor and afflicted. These are people that were not thought highly of in the world around them, and still today are not thought highly of. These are people that don't have others to vouch for them and to be concerned for most of the time. Again, in a world where things like physical beauty and wealth and social status and ambition and political power are the things that people become so concerned with, God is the one who characteristically stands up for those who have no one else to stand up for them. But even in the Pentateuch, God is still the one who judges impartially. The poor person who is wicked, it's not just because they're poor that God will stand up for them, but he will stand up for those who are afflicted, trusting in him, even when they particularly have no one else to stand up for them. That's when God steps in, because the world is characterized by judging according to that sort of partiality. But Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, the God who is revealed in Jesus, is still the God who judges based on the character of one's heart, and so the character of each one's work. This isn't a very popular understanding of God, even among Christians today, particularly for those that come from a Reformation understanding of justification by faith alone. It's hard to sort of balance out or to understand those statements of being saved by faith with the counterbalance of the fact that God still is the one who judges according to each one's work. But this is something that we see even in the letters of Paul. God, with his mercy, forgives and justifies all because of what Christ has done, and yet he's still the one that is judge at the end on the last day, that Christ will come again to judge the living and the dead. This is what the creeds say, and this is the full witness of the New Testament. Even Jesus himself, we have this in Matthew 25, and we also have this in John chapter 5, where Jesus himself talks about judgment according to the character of one's work. So what do we do with this? Well, even Luther, in his lectures on 1 Peter, says this is absolutely true, that God is the one who judges according to our work. But as Christians, we shouldn't be afraid of that, because our work reveals our faith, the character of our work. It's interesting, work is in the singular here, to each one's work. It's the full character of one's actions that reveal their heart. As one who follows God, who fears God in a reverential fear, not one who presumes upon God and then lives their life under the self-deception that just because their family is the person who built the church, or because that they went to a Christian school, or they have some sort of cultural claim on the Christian faith, that they will somehow be unscathed by God's judgment. That's not the way it works. we are to live out our faith in obedience. Peter has said that time and again throughout this letter, and he will say it again. Faith works its way out through works. And James, of course, is the letter that really hammers at this. We are to show that faith through the work of obedience in how we follow God in our works and our love towards others. Paul himself even says this in Galatians. It's not circumcision, it's not uncircumcision, but it's faith that works through love. Faith is always an active thing, and so it will have a very active life of Christian works and good works. And so the character of one's life is able to be judged to reveal what faith they had. Who is their God? Who is their Lord? We asked this in an earlier session. If Jesus is Lord, that means Caesar is not. How do our actions show who we are truly devoted towards? In an Old Testament way, you can phrase it like this. You become what you worship, and you show your priorities and who you're devoted towards by the shape of your life. And so Peter is getting at this very same thing, that we have God as our Father, but that should mean that we orient our lives in obedience towards Him. We should love our Father, and even as we boldly go to Him in confidence with prayer, we conduct our lives fearfully and reverentially towards Him in obedience and love, just as children should love their fathers. And thankfully, this Father that we have in God is not an abusive or capricious, but He is one that is characterized by mercy and faithfulness to His promises. And He showed that promise through the work of Jesus on the cross and in the resurrection. Another thing here, though, is God is the one who is judging according to each one's work. The idea of God making continually, even presently in the life of believers, God is the one who can admonish and discipline and train Christians for the strengthening of their faith. This could also be another part of what Peter is getting at here. This is not a future tense judgment, but this is even a present tense judgment. God is one who doesn't wait until the last day, but is one that even conducts judgment in the present. We don't always have insight into that, but as Christians who call upon God as Father, because the power of God that guards us through our faith, as we call upon Him in faith as Father, even when we're experiencing hardship or trials, even if we don't want to say, well, God's judging me here for this or that reason, we know that God is still a loving Father, but He strengthens our faith even through those trials and tribulations. Not things that God necessarily causes, but He can use. And so we see here that Christians are exhorted to live in that sort of reverential fear. Conduct yourselves in the time of your sojourning in this fear that respects God for who He is. Again, this is not a popular idea, not just among Christians that try to sort of falsely cling to a misunderstanding of salvation or justification by faith alone, apart from works. But also for those sort of cultural Christians who really misunderstand who God is. We live in a culture today that is defined more by a belief in God that's more therapeutic than real. And what I mean by that is, as long as God is convenient for people's lives, they use Him, or they have a belief or a prayer. As long as God plays His part, then Christians will sort of, or people will sort of call upon God. So God really depends upon us in that sort of belief system. As soon as things get tough, as soon as it seems like faith is not working, faith is abandoned. We see this in the parable of the sower. As soon as things get rough. But in today's culture, that, at least in Western culture, is very nihilistic. And what I mean by that is sort of the ultimate belief that there isn't really anything out there. And so you can kind of put God back into that equation as sort of part of the system that I choose for myself as therapeutic. God is sort of that grandfather in the sky that helps me when I need him, but when I don't really think about him. And this is kind of indicative of the sort of nihilism that doesn't really believe that there is any sort of ultimate meaning to life or any sort of ultimate God that provides meaning in a foundation and a framework for how we live our lives. This is completely alien to the message of 1 Peter. God is God, whether we like him to be or not. God is God when he is even acting rightfully as judge who looks at the true intentions of our hearts and the works that flow from our hearts and acts accordingly, even when it means judgment in those instances. And this God is revealed again through the resurrection of Jesus. As we are born to a new living hope in the resurrection, this is our ultimate sort of epistemological framework, our way of knowing God. God is the one who raised Jesus from the dead. You have to deal with that God, whether you like him to be real or not. Christianity did not just pop up out of nowhere, but it begins with the proclamation of an historical event of Jesus being raised to new life, something that only God, the God of the Bible, promised and is able to accomplish. And so, we are to conduct ourselves in this way. And then, verse 18, knowing that, not with things perishable, with gold or silver, that you have been purchased from the empty ways of life of your ancestral traditions, from the traditions of your fathers, things handed down to you, but with the price of the blood of Christ, just as a lamb unblemished and pure. And so our conduct of living life in a new way, related as resident aliens or sojourners, is due to the fact that we have been purchased, we have been redeemed. Just kind of going back to that idea of sojourners, I want to read a very early Christian writing that was probably from about 100 years after the letter of 1 Peter, but it deals with this idea of resident aliens. And this is from the epistle to Diognetus. You can find this in any sort of edition of the Apostolic Fathers. You can also read this for free online at the Christian Classic Ethereal Library, ccel.org. And so chapter 5 of the letter to Diognetus reads, "For the Christians are distinguished from other men neither by country, nor language, nor the customs which they observe. For they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a particular form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity. The course of conduct which they follow has not been devised by any speculation or deliberation of inquisitive men, nor do they, like some, proclaim themselves the advocates of any merely human doctrines, but inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, according as the lot of each of them has determined, and following the customs of the natives in respect to clothing, food, and the rest of ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens they share in all things with others, yet they endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land to them is their native country, and every land of their birth is a land of strangers. They marry as do all others. They beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men and are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of all things, and yet abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet they are very honored, but yet in their very dishonor are glorified. They are evil spoken of, and yet are justified. They are reviled and bless. They are insulted and repay the insult with honor. They do good, yet are punished as evildoers. This letter to Diognetus is getting at what Peter ultimately wants to indicate, that as foreigners in the gospel, foreigners of our customary lands and our cultures around us, we exhibit some markedly different priorities, even though in many ways we look and speak just like the world around us, speaking the language of our fatherland. Clothing it would be the same, and yet in ways that are different. Our set of allegiances and priorities are ultimately in following God, even though that can lead us to be good citizens and those who love and respect others around us. But we are purchased from the vain conduct of our ancestral traditions, Peter says. It's not with respect to clothing and food and music and things like that, but we are purchased away, we are redeemed away from those empty ways of life that show an ignorance to the living God. This is what verse 18 says. So on the one hand, this language of being purchased, of being redeemed, not with perishable things, with gold or silver, but with the blood of Jesus as a spotless and unblemished lamb. This language of being redeemed would have been recognizable among Peter's Gentile converts to Christianity. There were rituals and rites in the Greco-Roman world that dealt with how a slave was redeemed out of slavery, set free, and it required a technical sort of price called a time, and this is the word that's used here in verse 19, with the blood of Christ being the time, that price. And it meant that as one was freed from the particular authority of their earthly master, they were set into a new relationship to the deity or the idol that was sort of overseeing the ritual. Now, functionally, that meant that they were free to be their own person, but they lived in a new relationship to the deity that gave them this freedom. So on the one hand, Peter's audience, whether they were Jewish or Gentile, would have understood this language of being freed from slavery, being redeemed out from one authority and given a new life and a new way of life, characterized by a particular type of freedom, but also a new relationship to the deity. But ultimately, as we see, Peter uses the language of Isaiah chapter 53, the suffering servant who, like a sheep, goes to the slaughter, and also particularly the language of the Exodus in the Passover lamb, who was to be an unblemished and spotless lamb to stand in for the life of the firstborn. Collectively, the firstborn of God being Israel as a whole, but the firstborn of each household by which Israel was freed out from under the slavery to Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And so the language ultimately comes from the biblical story. Peter wants to show what the shape of their new life is like because they have received a newer and greatest Exodus moment. The Exodus in the Old Testament was the grand moment of the gospel of the Old Testament. In this act of Yahweh, even by giving his name Yahweh to Moses for the people of Israel, he was revealing a particular characteristic among the world and among his people, that he would be the Redeemer, the one who purchased his people from slavery out from under Pharaoh and given them a new life. But the idea of redemption is a broad term in the Old Testament. It meant that one was purchased out from slavery. It could mean protecting one's ancestral lands, the kinsman redeemer. The redeemer was one person in the family that would make sure that a murder was avenged or a debt was paid, or to redeem someone out from slavery, and to make sure that the family land stayed in the family, the ancestral land stayed within the family. Yahweh does all of these things in the Exodus because there was much more than just a physical slavery to Pharaoh. There was economic, there was the matter of receiving a land inheritance. There was also the avenging of the genocide of the children of Israel at the beginning of Exodus, and it was also a spiritual redemption where God redeemed his people to serve and to worship Yahweh in a new covenant relationship. Because in slavery they would not have been able to worship freely, but it would have exercised the customs and the traditions of the Egyptians. And so that model, that pattern, is ultimately revealed in the scriptures as through the work of Jesus. They have been purchased and by this through what Jesus had done on the cross. And ultimately, this interpretation of the death of Jesus comes from Jesus himself at the Last Supper, particularly in the Synoptic Gospels. He interprets his own death in the context of a Passover meal, where he says, "This is my blood of the new covenant shed for the ransom of many, for the redemption away from sins." And so Jesus is the first one to explicitly, in the life and ministry of Jesus himself is the one to explicitly refer to the moment of his death as an act of redemption, a newer and greater Passover. Just as the Passover in the Old Testament set up the pattern for who God is and how he acts on behalf of his people, and just as the prophets pointed to a newer and greater Exodus, so Jesus fulfills that. But this redemption is away from the vain or empty ways of life inherited by ancestors or family traditions. And so we see this redemption as for a particular purpose. It's to be taken out of, not just away from those vain traditions, but out of those traditions. When we talk about slavery, or even if we were to talk about a concept, a Christian concept such as original sin, we have to understand how the Bible, in very sort of practical ways, talks about sin or original sin. Peter doesn't bring up those terminologies, but it's getting at something that shows that the slavery that humans experience under ignorance of God, being outside of God and antagonistic to God, what Christians call sin, in very practical language, Peter is using the idea of inheriting an empty way of life, a systemic, broken relationship with God, a systemic sort of ignorance. When we think about being born into a family, we are contingent. We have histories that are contingent. We inherit not just sort of physical things when our parents pass, but we also inherit patterns of behavior. The dysfunctions of a family get passed on. We think about this even in other social dynamics. We talk about inherited poverty, generational poverty, that patterns of societal brokenness gets passed on, and people even talk about sort of systemic issues like systemic racism and systemic poverty, systemic injustice, where whole systems of behavior and whole human systems are broken. And so the only way that you can sort of get out of it is if you start from scratch or you have to fix the systemic issue. Peter is speaking in such a way as to suggest that outside of the grace of God, outside of the gospel proclamation, human beings exist in this systemic brokenness that we can't save ourselves out of. We can't save ourselves from the futile ways of our thinking or the particular actions that flow from that lead to ignorance in a life antagonistic to God, which is rightfully judged by God. But we need a grace, we need a redemption completely out of, to start fresh in a new way, to be redeemed out of that systemic brokenness for a system of life with God, for a new life, a new covenant relationship. And this is exactly what we get in Jesus, in those very sort of practical ways. In verse 20 and 21 says, this plan was set in place since the beginning of the world. That what was the plan in Jesus to redeem us was foreknown by God and planned in advance by God and has been revealed in these last days. And it happened for us. This is what Peter says at the end of his prayer with regards to the prophets, that Christians are living at the climax of history because everything that the Old Testament pointed to, all this whole plan that wasn't sort of enjoyed by the Old Testament people, but was pointed to and expected and hoped for, has now finally been revealed in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And it's through Jesus, through his death, by which we're purchased away from those dominions of sin, taken away out of ignorance to this new true relationship with God where we are confident to call him Father. All of this happened for us, that we would have faith in God, that we would know who the true and living God is. Again, our redemption is not freedom from sin, just to be free-floating individuals, but we are saved out of one relationship, a dysfunctional and abusive relationship under sin, and we are given a true, living, and healthy, life-giving relationship towards God through Jesus, who is the living and resurrected one. And so that we would have faith and hope in God through Jesus. So we're going to leave off there because we're kind of at the 30-minute mark, but we are going to pick up next time at verse 22. And we're going to see exactly what this redeemed life is. We are redeemed out of the futile ways of life, but we are redeemed for sort of redemptive living, a life that's shaped by this. As we are called to holiness, as we are called to enjoy this familial relationship with God, who is holy and distinct from all those empty ways, we are going to look at what our new shape of life looks like. As we've been bought with a price out of those sinful attitudes and activities, we're going to look at that new shape of life. And we're going to see that it is characterized by holy love. And with that, I invite you to ask your questions, and I hope that you feel comfortable to give your comments and questions in the Facebook section or the YouTube box underneath the video. So, what are your questions? What kind of conversation do you want to have on 1 Peter 1 verses 17 through 21? God bless.